The seas cover 70% of the Earth's surface. Historically speaking, the seas as well as waterways have always served as important conduits for transport and commerce. In the days of the empire, the seas were considered by some to be capable of subjugation to a national sovereignty. Means one nation can exercise claim over the sea as long as it can control that portion of sea through their military might. Particularly, the Portuguese proclaimed huge parts of the high seas as part of their national or territorial domain. These claims led to a response by Northern European powers because they were interested in exploration of the seas. They stood for the freedom of seas, and it served their purpose because they wanted to expand and explore commercial routes into the east through sea, and eventually they did that. You might know this from the success of the Dutch East India Company. Scholars, prominently Hugo Grotius, developed the doctrine of open seas, where oceans were supposed to be accessible to all the nations, and oceans were incapable of appropriation by any one of them. This means that the open seas were common heritage of mankind. You might know this as res communis. The freedom of high seas became a basic principle of international law. But not all parts of the seas were free. A coastal state was still allowed to keep some part of their maritime belt along its coastline as their territorial waters or territorial sea, and they could use this part similar to any other land territory that they had, so they could extend their sovereignty to this part of the maritime belt running along their coastline. Now, the extent or the length of this maritime belt to which states can exercise their sovereignty, it kept changing throughout the history. So, territorial sea is that part of the sea which runs along the coastline to a certain distance from the coastline. Now, initially, the width of this territorial sea was decided by the ability of the state to dominate it by military means. As long as you can control your shoreline and the belt running along that shoreline, you can keep it, and the rest of the area will be open sea. But eventually the states started asserting for more and more area to be under their control because of various reasons. There were possibilities like fisheries. They could mine the sea to extract oil. So because of these reasons, various other jurisdictional zones evolved. So the coastal states now wanted to exercise control over something called the contiguous zone, and the international law trend, which started with the principle of open seas, started moving towards larger and larger zones over which the states may exercise exclusive rights, such as fishery zones, continental shelves, EEZ, that is the exclusive economic zones. I will tell you about all these eventually. So initially, what started as a narrow maritime belt which extended up to 3 nautical miles from the coastline, it was increased to 12 nautical miles. Predominance of the concept of freedom of high seas started changing, and the trend of the law of sea started moving towards more and more exercise of sovereignty and control in exclusion to other states over certain parts of the seas by these coastal states. So overall, the law of sea provides a fascinating study because of the changes in technology and changes in the international environment, especially the political environment. These changes, combined with the expansion of state system, emerging of new states, and the political climate, led to very prominent changes in the law of sea. Let's just wait here and start with the most basic question first. That is, what is law of sea? Law of sea is, as the name suggests, the main subject of the law of sea is the sea. But what is sea exactly? And what is the scope of law of sea? So, as you know from your school geography lessons, sea is a smaller part of an ocean which is typically partially contained by an area of land. Therefore, all seas are found in areas where ocean and land meet. So, you can say that the ocean is a subject of the law of sea. The word sea is not described in any of the conventions which deal with the law of sea. So we have to go with our understanding of what sea is, and some scholars have pointed out certain principles that can help us to understand the applicability of the law of sea. First thing that you must understand is that the ocean as a subject of the law of sea is one single unit, and the characteristic feature is the continuity of marine spaces. A scholar named Giddel, he pointed out that the marine spaces governed by the law of sea must communicate freely and naturally with each other all over the world. This means basically that marine spaces must be connected to another sea or ocean by a narrow outlet, which is called a strait, right? So, if that water body is not connected to the ocean, then it cannot be a subject of the law of sea. For example, Caspian Sea. So the law of sea is not applicable to Caspian Sea because it is separated from the ocean. It is not connected with the ocean. And moreover, in order to freely and naturally communicate through the ocean, the water level of the body must essentially be the same. So the rules of the law of sea cannot be made applicable to a distinct body at a different altitude from the sea level. For example, a lake which is located in a mountain, right, which is a few meters high from the sea level. So, by this, we can conclude that rivers and lakes are a part of terrestrial territory and not governed by the law of sea. So, as simple as that, remember the concept of continuity of marine spaces and remember the example of Caspian Sea. Though it is called sea, but it's actually a lake, technically speaking. So, following this understanding, you should be able to now tell me whether Black Sea is a subject of the law of sea or not. Well, let's move ahead. Okay, so before I tell you more about the law of sea, I want you to know certain terms so that when I explain, I can explain in a flow and I do not have to stop in between to keep explaining these terms. So first I would like to tell you a bit about the types of marine spaces. And I am here just giving a definition so as to explain the different types of marine spaces to you. I'm not giving a legal definition. So those of you who are making notes, don't add this in your notes because we are going to be covering marine spaces in depth in another video. In this video, I'll just explain these terms to you so that you get clarity whenever I use these terms. I don't have to define them again and again. So basically, the whole sea is divided into various spaces, and these spaces are called marine spaces, and each of these spaces have different rights and entitlements and liabilities attached to them. So the law with different marine spaces is different. So marine spaces are divided into several jurisdictional zones, and all these marine spaces can be divided into two main categories. First is marine spaces under national jurisdiction, and second is spaces beyond national jurisdiction. So the first category contains internal waters, territorial seas, internal straits, archipelagic waters, contiguous zones, the EEZ, the continental shelf, and the second category contains the high seas and the area. The area basically means subsoil and seabed. So the first category contains marine spaces that are governed by territorial sovereignty. Now, the first category can be further subdivided into two subcategories. marine spaces which are governed by territorial sovereignty, and marine spaces which are beyond territorial sovereignty but under national jurisdiction of a coastal state. So overall there are two main categories: jurisdictional zones under national jurisdiction and those beyond national jurisdiction. Under national jurisdiction there are further two subcategories: spaces governed by territorial sovereignty and spaces beyond territorial sovereignty but where there are some several rights which the state has. So we'll look at what spaces fall under which category and subcategory. Now the first subcategory is marine spaces governed by territorial sovereignty. This category of marine spaces contains internal waters, territorial seas, international straits, and archipelagic waters. Territorial sovereignty is characterized by completeness and exclusiveness. This means state has complete jurisdiction in the sense that it comprises three elements unless international law provides otherwise. So over internal waters, territorial seas, and international straits and archipelagic waters, the coastal state has complete jurisdiction as if it was a part of their territory. So the same laws apply which apply to their territory. Now the second subcategory under the first category relates to marine spaces which are beyond territorial sovereignty but are under national jurisdiction of coastal states. So coastal state still has some rights here, though it's not territorial sovereignty but it is under national jurisdiction. So in this, the EEZ, that is the economic zone, and the continental shelf are included, and also the contiguous zone. So I have told you the classification. Now I will tell you what each of these marine spaces mean. So internal waters, territorial seas, international states, archipelagic waters, contiguous zone, the EEZ, the continental shelf, the high seas, and the area. So I'll explain what each of these mean briefly, and I'm not giving a legal definition, so don't write it in your notes yet. I'll be giving legal definition in future videos. This is just to explain certain terms to you now so that we don't have to keep explaining it again and again. So let's start with internal waters. Internal waters are simply those waters which lie landwards of the baseline from which the territorial sea is measured. So all these zones which I spoke about, they are measured after drawing a baseline. Some baseline is drawn. Whatever lies inwards of the baseline, as you can see in the picture, is called internal waters. So again, internal waters are those waters which lie landward of the baseline from which the territorial sea is measured. What is baseline? How is baseline drawn? That we will study in another video. As of now, just know what internal waters are. Second, the territorial sea. Territorial sea is a marine space under territorial sovereignty of the coastal state. Remember, it comes under first subcategory. Now, a space which comes up to a limit not exceeding 12 nautical miles measured from the baseline. So inwards of the baseline you have the internal waters, and waters up to a limit not exceeding 12 nautical miles, that they are called territorial sea and or territorial waters. Remember, it falls in first subcategory. That means the state has full territorial sovereignty over this area. Now next is archipelagic waters. Archipelagic waters are simply waters which are enclosed by archipelagic baselines, means that's related to archipelago. Now archipelago means a group of islands, and if there is a group of islands which are close to each other, one archipelagic baseline will be drawn, and all the waters coming inside that baseline will be called archipelagic waters. The explanation will become very easy if you just see the image. Let's move on to the next, that is the contiguous zone. Contiguous zone is a maritime zone that is adjacent to the territorial sea, and it may not exceed beyond 24 miles, 24 nautical miles from the baseline from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, right? So 12 miles from the baseline is territorial sea, 24 miles is contiguous zone, both from the baseline. Now next is EEZ, that is the exclusive economic zone. That is an area beyond and adjacent to the territorial sea and not extending beyond 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the territorial sea, right? So 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the territorial sea is the exclusive economic zone. Now remember, this distance is also measured from the same baseline from which the territorial waters and the contiguous zone are measured, as you can see in the picture. Next is the continental shelf. The continental shelf is an area that is adjacent to a continent or around an island extending from the low water line to the depth at which there is usually a marked increase in the slope to greater depth. So continental shelf is, as you can see in the map, area which is adjacent to the shoreline where waters run shallow. Now next is the high seas. High seas are basically all parts of the sea which are not included in the EEZ or the territorial sea or internal waters or in the archipelagic waters of an archipelagic state. So all parts which are not included in other zones are the high seas. And finally, the area is the seabed and the ocean floor and the subsoil in the ocean floor. That is called simply the area, right? That must be beyond national jurisdiction. So seabed, ocean floor and subsoil beyond the limits of national jurisdiction is the area. So that's it about all the different maritime spaces. I have just given you a general definition so that you understand these words, how the baseline is drawn and what principles we apply to measure baselines, what are different laws related to each of these maritime zones, what conventions govern each of these maritime zones. That we will study in future videos. Don't worry about that. This is just an introductory video where I want to clear certain terms of the law of sea. So with this, I'll end this introductory video, and in the next video we'll begin with the history of the law of sea. Thank you for watching.